Prologue, Tianjin, China, 2 weeks after the suicide mission. The morning skies were always tinged with blood. With the industrial air pollution clearing more each day, Talia Shazari was able to see more sunrises like this. She wondered if this was what her people saw back home when they designed their flag. That was far before her time. What truly mattered was that she and her people were the only remaining Japanese in the world. Her father, Tandori Shizari, had often told her of the constant struggle their people had faced, the perils of nuclear energy that forced an exodus to the Senkaku Islands, and then the war which saw her people enslaved and moved to the Chinese mainland to help rebuild. The history of her people's conflict with the Chinese was for historians to debate and ponder over. She had been bred and trained for war, or so she had thought. In her time with the group known as the Crusaders, Talia had learned about herself, her god, and the world she inhabited. There were other issues than her own people's freedom, and she had seen friends die for them. That had been harder to deal with than watching any of her people fall. The Crusaders were the people she had fought and bled with, and now many of them were gone. Her battles here paled in comparison. There was no honor in fighting the child soldiers the Chinese forced into battle. Once she thought striking them down had made her immortal in God's eyes, that she was chosen to lead her people to a new age, to a new freedom. Now she wondered if she was nothing more than a murderer whose mind had been indoctrinated by her heritage. Talia couldn't imagine being like her comrade Mikhail. He was a warrior but lacked a soul. Still, Talia was finding it easy to make the comparison, and hard to find the distinction. She sighed aloud as light footsteps approached behind her. "Good morning, father," she said, not glancing back. Tandori moved beside his daughter. "Good morning," he replied, resting his hands on the balcony's railing. "You know I worry for you on these mornings. You spend all this time looking to the east, but I wonder, are you looking towards home or father?" Talia did not reply. She knew her father was trying to encourage her, if only so they could achieve their goal. Seeing some of the old world only drove her into wanting to see the rest. "What was mother like, father?" Talia asked. It was a question Tandori was both prepared and unprepared to answer. He had raised his daughter to believe her mother had been intelligent and deadly, but also that she had betrayed her people by leaving their fight so early, and then eventually dying. Some of that was lies created for her daughter's benefit. It was just another reason he had hated sending her away, for he knew Talia would see what her mother saw on the other side of the ocean. He also knew she would become privy to details of her mother's life that he had kept from her. "You know what I've told you, Talia, but the truth is much more complicated. She was an explorer. Japan and later Senkaku was not enough for her, so it did not surprise me when she went back to working for Jack Newsom after you were born. I think she would have liked to explore motherhood a bit more, but she had other goals she needed to accomplish first." "Did her work help?" Talia asked. "Without it, we would have never taken Tianjin from the slavers. I worried about what she told the Gaijin, even though she trusted them. Yet it seems that yielded us the information we were awarded about Beijing's reactor, a bargaining chip Jack Newsom used to his advantage, for you." Talia tilted her head to the side. "What do you mean?" Tandori smiled. "Even so far away, Sifex understood how similar the two of you would be. She knew I would try to keep you here so you would help our fight. And she knew I wanted to shelter you from the outside world. I see now that she was wiser than I. It is hard to know yourself when you're unaware of your surroundings and the stakes you've been playing for. It was selfish of me to believe I could keep you hidden away. Selfish and foolish." Talia reached out and rested an arm on her father's shoulder. That was something she never would have done in her life before the Crusaders. She could see that her father needed her reassurance. "You did what you thought was right," Talia said. "Without you I would not know combat, my faith, or my history. All of these have shaped me. They remind me that I have duties here I must perform.
Mother believed in helping from afar, but I will help here with the allies I secured abroad. When we have succeeded, I may explore again just as she did. For now, though, father, I remain to help our people.
Tandori looked towards his daughter again, with a sense of pride. He smiled again. It was exactly what he needed to hear. He reached up and placed a hand over his daughter's. For the next hour, the two watched the sun rise above them. Talia went on her afternoon patrol around the camps and each old hangar alongside the ocean docks. Her people had been expanding with the lack of Chinese soldiers pushing into their territory. Her father had revealed that it was not an indication of defeat or retreat, however. Their enemies were busy building their Cloudbreaker reactor, and once it was finished, they would bring the bulk of their forces upon Tianjin. Talia would contact New Purgatory soon, but not before she had a solid plan in place and a grasp on how close the Chinese were to finishing their work. For that, she needed to use a contact her father did not know of, nor approve of if he did. Talia walked into a solitary camp in the corner of the hangar. A moldy tent was draped off the building's metal siding. There was a fire out front with the spit rotating over it. Several empty jugs were knocked over beside the fire. Talia thought they were likely liquor, which was not surprising for a man like Takeo Kaji. She could see his half-naked body passed out on an old mattress. Talia debated waking him, but opted to wait. She hadn't eaten this morning, so she walked to the makeshift markets for some of the questionable fish her people had caught. She thought again of her father. He would hate to see her down here, slumming with her people. But that was the reality of their lives. It wasn't as if the food and drink he had was any better because he lived in the catwalks above. And there was something to be said about walking amongst kin. Seeing their faces was a reminder of who and what she was fighting for. She stopped at one stall and pointed to a smaller fish and traded some old rations from New Purgatory for it. Talia brought it back over to Takeo's tent. She took a small blade and went to work shaving the scales from the fish before putting it over the spit. The smell that wafted around the camp reminded her of her room back in New Purgatory. All the smells of food rising from the kitchen below. All of it was far cleaner and healthier than the mercury-soaked fish they had to haul up from Tianjin's polluted coastline. Talia sighed and heard a stirring from Keiji's tent. "What's that smell?" he asked in Japanese.
Lunch,
Talia replied in English.
get up. We need to talk.
Takeo got out of the tent and stretched. Talia looked up and saw his back. It was covered in the intricate work of a tattoo artist. The tattoos reminded her of Otto, except Takeo had not been a soldier. His past was darker. He had been a member of the criminal Yakuza, an organization long since forgotten after the war.
Or so our people would like to believe,
she thought.
And here I thought no woman would ever cook for me again,
Takeo said with a groan.
Pig,
Talia replied as she rotated the spit.
Why have you come, Talia? The food is a nice touch, but I know you want something from me. Your connections. I need information from Beijing, and I need to get the message out.
Takeo's head perked up.
You know how risky that is. Your father forbids all communication with even the slaves. I don't need you to remind me of my father's rules. Can you help me or not?
The Yakuza let out a sigh and eyed her sword. Of all the people in the camps, only he could match her in combat. Her father had given up the art years ago.
It will take some time if the information you seek is what we spoke of before. That depends on the success of your organization,
Talia replied. Takeo nodded as he reached for one of the fish on the spit.
And the message is that to go to New Purgatory then?
Talia shook her head. He knew her well from the nights they had spent locked in combat under the light of the moon.
Yes, Kaji,
she replied, starting to walk away.
What? Don't you want your fish?
Talia didn't respond and soon disappeared into the crowd. She decided to spend the rest of her day roaming Tianjin's empty wastes. She moved by the shattered buildings, walked over broken glass, and tried to imagine what the city might have looked like 20 years ago. She needed to distance her mind from the favors she would ask of her friends. Life was fickle, short, and unpredictable. Before she embarked on Alexander Velasco's mission, she thought it would be simple. Her combat experience made her feel untouchable, watched over and shielded by God. Her injuries, the people she faced, and the friends she lost spit in the face of all of that. Asking her friends to risk their lives for her now felt selfish. Alex did it, and she knew he owed her a favor, but the realities of war began to eat away at her morale.
Could I have been someone else? A painter, a dancer, an architect? Could I have been brought into this world to build instead of kill? From the time I was born to now, all I've ever known is to kill the enemy. Why nothing else?
Talia knew why. If her people were oppressed, there was time for nothing else but war. From her father's point of view, she would only have a chance to start again after their war. But Talia held on to a weariness she could not express to him. She was tired of war, of her faith, of the countless number of dead on every side.
How many have I killed?
She asked to herself as she sat in a park where grass and flowers once grew. Talia had kept track when she had begun wiping out Chinese incursion teams. She had stopped after Morrison's tower. There was no way to count that many lives, innocent or otherwise. Doubt crept into her heart where faith was once strong. She reached to her side and drew her katana, setting it in front of her in its sheath. And then she reached behind her for the hook sword she had taken off a fallen foe from Morrison's tower. She stared at the two for a time. One was a tool, the other was a trophy.
2 weeks.
2 weeks was all it took to reflect on what had happened in New Purgatory. She had been part of revolution in action, and all the loss that came along with it. Talia saw what the cost was. She saw that it would not be as simple as she once imagined, as perhaps her father and all the other refugees in Tianjin thought. Her neck felt heavy, as if the dog tag she had been gifted didn't seem to fit her anymore. Talia decided to rectify that. Inside of her robe, she reached for a short blade she used for close quarters combat. Next, she removed her tags and set them on a flat stone. Talia used the small blade to bring a sharp line across the word faith that adorned her tag, then carved a word below it. When she was finished, she wiped off the metal shavings, put her short blade back, and put her tags back on. Talia stood and made her way for her father's camp. There would be time to address doubt later. Severnaya Zemlya, Siberia, Russia. Several months after the suicide mission. Time had passed and snow had drifted, but for Mikhail Koslov, his life had felt like it passed in seconds. He had returned to where he had been created, out in the frozen wasteland of northern Russia. He had not intended to return here. He expected that his former fellow Crusader Brandon Dwigu's old platoon would remain, but they had vacated the old facility. To where, Mikhail did not know, nor did he care. Many of their supplies had been left behind: food, juice, furs, small conveniences he did not need but made his life simpler. Returning to Severnaya base had given him the opportunity to think about the previous months. Mikhail was uncertain of the choice he had made the night John Morrison had fallen, but he was sure of Jack Newsom's information. Before their suicide mission, old Jack Newsom had left varying gifts for a team he never truly led, but one he ended up caring deeply about. More interesting to Mikhail was that the old man knew of Mikhail's responsibility for the old world's current environment. It puzzled the Shadow that Newsom had not revealed that secret. Mikhail assumed it did not serve the old man's purposes, yet there was another reason the Shadow had to leave. His flashbacks were becoming more intense, and his emotions were slowly flooding back in the form of outbursts he could not control. Mikhail knew he had to leave Alex and his team before the guilt of his decisions ate away at his mind. Mikhail flipped the disc Jack Newsom had given him between his fingers. The Russian was a creature created to be the perfect assassin, devoid of fear, pain, all emotion that would make the average man question his worth or allow his conscience to get the better of him. But like so many other abominations spawned from the old world, he had also been a failure. His creators had succeeded in destroying a single man's life, the world, and the chance of Russia returning to the stage as a global superpower. The Shadow shuttered his vision, causing his golden iris to enclose around his white pupil and then extend out again. He had waited, Mikhail wanted to know if the flashbacks would stop due to a lack of stimuli, if the emotions that were surfacing would dissipate, but they had not. Mikhail clasped the disk in one hand. The database in his mind began to play it out seamlessly before his eyes. For the first time, he would see what Jack Newsom had left him. Thought some of this information stored here might interest you, Koslov. Not sure if it helps or not, but you'd know better than I. Newsom disappeared, and the data within contained full readouts of the Shadow's past, his history, all the procedures done to him. Mikhail wished the old man was still alive so he could ask him how he came to acquire this information. The old man had held on to many secrets he had taken to his grave. Koslov began reading through the reports. Some of the dated files contained information he was already aware of. He had been a Spetsnaz soldier that served in both Chechen wars, a rarity given the difference in time. He remembered being selected for Project Harvest Shadow, not knowing entirely what it was, but being proud to continue serving his country. According to the reports, he had been born in Nahotka, to a family of fishermen. He had joined the military to leave that life behind. While traveling, he spent much of his time painting and spending late evenings in diners and bars where he would read in the dimly lit corners of the room. There were pictures that went along with each report. Mikhail then realized this was a product of the KGB doing intelligence reports on him. Some were before the first war in Chechnya, and some were after. They had been sizing him up for a long time, and the reports were thorough. It was the pictures of his wife that made him stop reading. He stared at the picture for a time. It hurt. He could not remember her, not her smell or her laugh, but the portrait of her smiling to a camera while he smiled towards her triggered a repressed memory in the back of his mind. He could feel the disc fall from his fingers as his world turned black. An altar. He was standing at an altar in a small church in Smolensk, many miles away from home. Today he was going to be married. Mikhail watched his bride-to-be, Maya, walking towards him down the center aisle. There was no one in attendance save for themselves and the pastor. The two young lovers struggled to hide their smiles. Mikhail could see Maya's red hair poking through her white veil. As she approached him, she reached out and straightened the collar on his gray dress uniform.
Это выглядит как ваши глаза. It looks like your eyes.
Gray. His eyes had been gray once. Mikhail smiled at her, and the two allowed the pastor to begin the ceremony. It did not take long. Mikhail and Maya turned towards each other. He reached up and lifted the veil from her face. His world darkened as he leaned in to kiss his wife. Mikhail awoke on the floor of Zemlya's base's mess hall. The disc lay beside him. He was in a state of disbelief. He had been married and could remember nothing of it, save for that one moment in Smolensk church. Mikhail felt anger rising in his chest. It was a rare feeling that occasionally broke the bonds of the database. It rivaled the night he killed his czar and set fire to the world, damning his home, his people, and too many billions. He did not wish to review the rest of the disc, not now. He did not want to watch it as an outsider, hoping to remember what he could never make sense. He needed to get his old life back first. The notes Mikhail had compiled on Project Harvest Shadow were extensive, but even with Newsom's data disk, there was nothing that pointed to a reversal of the procedure. It was clear the scientists and head members of the Russian government had no intention of reversing the effects on their assassins. He was a tool to be used and discarded. Mikhail decided to take a break from his research and go walk out in the snow. He hoped that would help clear his mind enough to find a new solution where one had not existed before. Even at the start of summer, snow still fell hard on the compound. The hell chopper he had stolen was covered in it. He had been here for some time, and still had as many answers to his problem as when he first returned. The ground beneath his feet crunched as he took step after step towards his bird. Crunching. He looked down and remembered where he was. The ice picks. The survival in the snow. The main courtyard was littered with bones, and he had been stepping on them. Several had cracked and split under him. He wondered how many he had crushed just by landing here instead of inside the hangar. The familiar sound of another hell chopper stirred him from his thoughts. Here? Now? Mikhail ran for one of the entrances back into the base. He could hide, watch, and then eliminate, but he saw little point to it. He could just dispatch them where they stood without all the running around. As he entered the hangar, he saw a hell chopper waiting for him. He waited until the rear ramp opened and watched a woman at the head of the group of soldiers. All of them were wearing the familiar digitized black and gray, Morrison's Marines colors. The Shadow debated reaching for his pistol and ending them all right here, but decided he would hear them out first, unless they were actively hostile. Identify yourselves, Mikhail said aloud. The woman leading the group stepped towards him. Her blonde hair was pulled back and knotted, her body hidden by her heavy military fatigues and jacket. Her blue eyes stared intently at Mikhail's golden ones. I'm Captain Renata Carver. You must be Mikhail Koslov. Mikhail nodded at Carver. Why have you come to my home, Captain? Only death awaits those who venture where they are not wanted. Carver didn't look perturbed by the comment. She laced her fingers behind her back and spoke again. There's quite a large bounty out on you and your old team. Mikhail's reaction was to smile. He struggled to understand why people did that in the face of annihilation, yet the database felt it was a suitable intimidation tactic. You only brought 2 other soldiers to deal with me? I imagine the others must already be dead, and this is all you have left, Mikhail replied. None of us are here to deal with you, Koslov. We're here for information. The Shadow tilted his head to the side. What kind of information? The locations of your old team. The man who pays us has no interest in harming you. I can't say the same about the other Crusaders. Yet he does not come here himself? He does, in a manner of speaking. Carver reached into one of her many pockets and retrieved a circular blue object. It looked like a grenade. She bent down and rolled it into the space between her and the Shadow. After a few moments, a hologram of a man appeared. He was stout, with a full head of white hair and a thick white beard that was kept trim near his face. Mikhail's database had no match of the man on record.
Mikhail Andreevich Koslov, it is so good to finally make your acquaintance. I trust you've left the team I sent mostly intact, the holographic man said. No deaths, sir. He let us in willingly, Carver answered. How interesting for a man of known temperament. I half expected you to murder them all. Life evolves in many ways a man does not expect, Mikhail replied. That does not mean they will leave as safely as they arrived. Who are you? Yes. Forgive me, Agent Koslov. I am Dr. Thomas Baruger, part of Berlin's current leadership and a moderate professional in my field. You are modest for a man who helped save parts of the world by creating the Cloudbreaker reactors, Mikhail replied. And a rather civilized for a man that destroyed most of that world, Baruger replied. Mikhail wondered if this was what shock felt like. He had been taken off guard by Baruger. He thought that only himself and somehow Jack Newsom knew what happened the night the world was destroyed. Don't act so surprised, Mikhail. It's unbecoming of your programming, Baruger continued. It is impossible for you to have known. Quite the contrary. You see, after Cloudbreaker had been distributed, my government sanctioned me to work on a network that monitored both China and Russia. It was a gamble, of course, only monitoring those 2 places for the first nuclear strike. But my hunch was eventually vindicated, Baruger explained. Even if you knew, that does not implicate me, Mikhail stated. Perhaps not. It does, however, add to the overall data collected on the base you and my soldiers are currently standing in. The same base where Russian scientists and descendants of German scientists taken in World War II attempted to create the perfect soldier. Tried and failed. Oh, indeed. Otherwise you would not be fighting in petty crusades or trying to reclaim whatever is left of your humanity. And so that is why you have sent your soldiers to me. It is because of the death of John Morrison and those that followed him, Mikhail replied. John Morrison, my departed and dear friend's son, is of little concern to me. I am more worried about the power vacuum created by his death. Even you must realize that a group like yours could not run an entire city. Alexander Velasco is a man that can do much. He and his group will rebuild. I know nothing of building and ruling cities, nor do I wish to. Of course not. You only have one wish, don't you? You want your memories back. You want to remember. Is that not why you started the Great War?
Mikhail did not reply. Instead, he clenched his fists. He wanted to kill this man, and his dogs, if only to return the peace that this place had granted. The shadow fought down that urge. Get to the point. I do not want to suffer your presence any longer.
I offer you a trade, Shadow. One you will find fair and might lead to further cooperation.
The shadow waited for the doctor to speak again. Mikhail did not need any more enticing. The games Brugger played with words wore thin on the parts of his mind that remembered killing Tsar Putin. In that moment, he wanted to strangle Brugger with a strand of razor wire.
I want the location of the Crusaders,
Brugger continued.
I want to know where I can find them so that I may end them. And when that is done, I shall return to you that which you want most, your memories. The only cost to you is all you have become. Your database and your skills will all be lost as a result.
Mikhail took a moment to consider. He knew that Berlin had become the world's leader in scientific endeavors since the end of the war. But did the man truly know enough to change him back to normal? The shadow took a deep breath and cracked his knuckles. I don't have the information you seek, but I will give your soldiers the same opportunity to leave my home in peace. The image of the German doctor smiled at Mikhail.
Very well, Koslov, but I believe that you will change your mind in time. Should that happen, and to remain neutral to me, know that my offer still stands.
The doctor turned his back to the shadow and looked out at Captain Carver.
Renata, bring your team home.
Yes, sir, Carver replied with a salute. As the image of Thomas Brugger disappeared, Mikhail had an urge to attack the mercenaries. He knew it was unwise, especially out in the open, but more than that was the repercussions of committing that action. Mikhail did not understand why he was having this sudden outburst of anger. He was used to the database sorting out his emotions he was still working to comprehend. It puzzled him that the database agreed with his need to engage in combat. If Brugger was after the Crusaders, then he would seek them out instead of remaining to try and convince Mikhail. But if Mikhail killed the mercenaries, Brugger might postpone his hunt to engage the Shadow instead. Mikhail could find no fault with that argument, but his body was already reacting. His hand reached for his pistol while the soldiers had their backs turned. He fired a round into each of the soldiers' heads except Carver. Instead, he aimed at the back of her knees and let off 2 more rounds. She screamed out in pain and at the horror of her fallen comrades.
We had a deal,
she screamed. Crawl, Carver, Mikhail whispered. Crawl up to your bird and return to your master. Tell him that if he wants the Crusaders, then he will have to hunt through the shadows first. Mikhail watched as the captain crawled on her arms until the ramp closed. As the bird took off back into the blizzard, he felt satisfied. The hate he endured moments ago was gone. Before him lay the bodies of 2 of the soldiers that had disembarked with Carver. He had executed them. The Shadow had spent much of his new life murdering for profit, but he had never killed anyone in this manner because they had angered him. He had agreed to spare them, and now 2 soldiers were dead, and Carver was maimed for life. He had lied. The database had not done it for him. Yet another reason that he needed to find a way to revert to his old life. But not with Brugger. I would rather die. He dragged the bodies outside before returning to the base. All the while, he made the database play classical music to soothe his mind, if only so he could concentrate on finding a solution to yet another threat. Manhattan Island, New Purgatory, several months after the suicide mission. Janet woke up again with the same nightmare. John Morrison's tower, forged of steel and death, was falling around her, and she was forced to watch as she fell through floor after floor until crashing into her grave. Janet pushed her body up. She had sweat through another set of sheets. That was the third set this week. She reached for her watch on the nightstand. 3:37. Fuck, she said to herself, pushing up and out of the bed. This happened off and on after Alex, Layla, and the rest had taken off, leaving her to rebuild New Purgatory alone. She made her way to the shower and rinsed herself off, clenching her dog tags as the lukewarm water ran over her body. Janet sighed. There must have been more issues with the plumbing. The problems were unending. She took a deep breath and shut the water off. Janet dried herself and wrapped the towel around her long brown hair, and then threw on her combat fatigues. She tossed the towel off to the side before she put on her shirt and then pulled her hair into a ponytail. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and debated on eyeshadow. Fuck it, the bags under my eyes are good enough. She found herself on the floor of Alonso's club a few minutes later. The crowd had died down this late into the night. There were still a few stragglers, but the bar was in the middle of closing and there were cleaners at the edges of the bright dance floor. In all this chaos, I'll never understand how Alonso's kept this fucking place running. City on fire, riots, war, rebuilding. And he still manages to keep the booze and music flowing. Janet sat at the bar, and immediately one of the girls working behind it came over. Still can't sleep, Miss Trishella? Janet smiled. The girl, Vesper, had been a friend since she took the reins of the city. I keep telling you to just call me Janet. And yes, sleep isn't coming around the way it should. Do you want a shot of something? Janet debated that for a moment, but thought better of it. No, I'm already up. Might as well get some work done. I'll take coffee if you got it. Sure thing. Vesper ran off to get the maker running, while Janet spun around in her seat. A month ago, Alonso's had felt safe, a place she could go to see her friends. Now all of them were gone, and that feeling of security had been replaced with emptiness. Vesper set the cup down on the bar. Janet reached for it and spun back around. Know anything about the water heater fucking up? System is shot again. We had to boil the water for glass washing, Vesper replied. Who's working on it? Janet asked. Vesper shook her head. Not sure. It's been like this for a few days, so at this point, probably no one. Oh, for fuck's sake. Janet sucked down some of the coffee. It's like anything else. If you don't do it yourself, it never gets done. She stood up and made for the basement, bringing the cup with her. By the time she checked her watch again, it was 10 till 6. Janet was covered in grease, but at least she knew the hot water was working again. Just in time for another shower. As she climbed back up the stairs with her now empty coffee cup in hand, she was stopped by one of the attendants that helped her keep track of the city. Janet, we have some issues we need to discuss today. Janet kept walking up, motioning for the man to follow. There's always issues. What is it today? Some of the Brooklyn refugees are complaining about food supplies. The particulars are not having enough and the shipments of food coming in late. We'll tell them when they can start helping us with vertical farming, they'll have more food. They can either send people here or clear a building for a new grow-op. It's their choice. Yes, ma'am. Also, Janet stopped and turned so hard the grease on her boots nearly made her slip. Don't call me ma'am. Yes, Janet. She turned back around and started up the stairs. What else? Reconstruction efforts. We need to decide whether to clear rubble and wreckage from the streets or attempt to rebuild and renovate more apartments. Alexander lived in a hole in the wall made by a tank and sucked out of drain pipes for water for years. Clean the garbage first and salvage whatever materials usable for building, Janet replied. We'll have it all done. Janet reached the door and opened it, but first looked back at the attendant. Is there something else, or were you following me in to watch me get naked? No, Janet, but there was one other issue. It's about the garden. We still have refugees that need a place to live, but we haven't cracked it open yet. This issue had come up before, and it was stupid enough to make Janet want to put a bullet in her own brain. Of all the places left in the world, John Morrison had taken a special interest in Madison Square Garden. So much so that he had reinforced it and welded all the entrances shut. Some had assumed it was to preserve it, while others believed he had intended to use it as a sanctuary should he ever be deposed. Now it was just a nuisance that could have been used as extra shelter. Janet knew there had to be a secret entrance to it somewhere, but she was tired of wasting time and manpower on looking for it. Get a group of people that knows their way around there and some C4. I want them to meet me here in an hour and we'll finally deal with that fucking place so I can scratch it off my goddamn list. It will be done. The attendant turned and made his way back down the stairs. Janet let out a sigh. Nothing ever got done that she didn't have a hand in. She understood that people were both nervous and scared. The city had gone through a regime change. It was hard enough to think independently when the last leader was willing to murder anyone who spoke out against him. That was killing progress now. She needed people who could think for themselves. As she moved into the large flat and made for her room, she stripped off her greasy fatigues and entered the shower. The water was warmer now. She wanted to relax, so she sat on the floor and let the water fall down her face and back. Janet watched the black, oily water swirl down the drain. Her mind went to her friends. This was her issue with relaxation. Her mind wouldn't let her sit back and enjoy the moment. It had to be occupied, either by work, entertainment, stress, vengeance, or pain. Elias. No, she didn't want to think of him. She didn't want to think about how he could have helped her rebuild, how he could have kept his best friend here to lead, how happy she would have been to see his smiling face and feel his touch once more. The thought of his love hurt her. Short as it was, it didn't matter. He had cared, and so had she. She picked herself up and washed off the rest of the grease. If she kept on thinking about Eli, she would lose her mind. Janet hoped that in this new world she helped create, that yesterday's sins and memories would wash off like so much grime. But no matter what she went through, no matter how hard she worked, no matter how dirty her hands got or how her body bled, she still felt like her soul was stained. She was starting to understand why her father had given his life for a cause, and why Jack Newsom was so willing to sacrifice himself. There's only so much a woman can take. Janet got out of the shower and began looking for clean clothes. There might well have been a limit on pain, but she was not there yet. There was too much in the world left for her to do. An hour passed, and Janet had moved into position with her team at the garden's main entrance. She could see by the scarred exterior that welders had already tried to cut through the doors to no avail, and that made her wonder what Morrison kept under lock in this place. With no discernible entrance, he could not have used it as a shelter, and it couldn't be another prison if there was no way to transport inmates. Set charges on those doors and fall back to the street. Use double of what you were planning, Janet ordered as she watched her sappers acknowledge her and move into position. When they were finished, the team fell back behind the husk of an old city bus. Do it, she called out. An explosion rang out, and moments later Janet was dusting off her clothing from the rock and rubble that fell like rain on top of them. When it was over, she stood and leaned from the side of the bus with her rifle. The smoke began to clear, and she saw the door was still intact, but the stairs leading up to it had been destroyed. Oh, for the love of... Janet, there's some waster asking for you at the perimeter. That was one of her soldiers calling her over the comm. Really? Right now? She replied. He says he can help, and he knows a way in. Janet shook her head. There were plenty of wasters that had the solution to all her problems, but most turned out to be con artists and thieves. Fine, send him in. But if he's a problem, you're coming to get him. She clicked off her comm before the soldier could respond. Her people meant well, but common sense was lacking. They knew how to survive well enough, but not how to build, farm, or fight. When the man finally approached, he was not what Janet expected. His skin was ebony that rivaled the hue of Morrison's obsidian-colored tower. His face was not cragged and scarred like so many other men. Instead, it was covered in light stubble. His head was shaved around the sides, save for the top. As he came forward, he took his jacket off and extended a hand. Tyrese Vale. Janet reached out and shook his hand. Janet Trishella. Yes, I know. I know all about you and your team. I made all you an area of study. Janet shook her head dismissively. That's a first. I know you have no reason to trust me. A lot of good wasters used to be in Morrison's prisons, but I brought you something for goodwill. I wanted to keep it, but I get the feeling it's worth more to you. Vale went to reach into his pocket, which made Janet grip her rifle tight. She watched as he pulled out a chain. At the end of it, a worn dog tag. Her eyes grew wide as he handed it to her. On one side read Fox, and on the other, Brandon Duigu. How the hell did you find this? She growled. I've had people scavenging every day. They weren't looking in the right places. I found him, his tags, and his rifle just outside the tower's wreckage. Janet gripped the tags. What did you do with him? I buried him away from that place, near S4 where McGrath's brother was buried. His rifle is in my home if you want that too, Vale explained. Janet was in disbelief. Why have you done all this? I can answer that after I've helped you get into the garden, though you might not like what you find. And why is that? You'll have to follow me and see. If you're the hero I've made you out to be, then you'll make the right choice. I'm not big on being tested, Tyrese. I prefer straight answers and straight fights. You and I both know that life is rarely so easy. So if you genuinely believe that, then you'll have no issue judging what's to come, the man replied. Janet spat off to the side and reached for one of the cigarettes inside of her pocket, then plucked it in her mouth. Well, after you then. Janet followed Tyrese around the block and into the building across from the garden. She was confused and began expecting an ambush until he took a set of stairs into a basement. Her mind kept working at the possibilities, and then they reached a long stretch of hallway. An underground route? How in the hell would he have thought the entrance was secure in a ruined building? Janet asked. You'll see, Tyrese replied. Janet shook her head. If this was a trap, she knew she was falling right into it. The questions she had were boiling inside of her, and all she could do was wait until Tyrese revealed this place to her. After they passed the hall, they reached another door. Vale stopped, like he was going to turn around and say something. He looked down at Janet's rifle, and then looked up at her eyes, but didn't say a word. Janet decided to sling it across her back. She wasn't about to start a fight in unfamiliar territory. Tyrese opened the door, and dim light poured into their hall. She followed him as he explained the surroundings. We're going past the old locker rooms. People here use them for showers and bathrooms now, but they're in serious disrepair. He led her out into the main room of the stadium. There were sleeping bags and fire pits everywhere, and more people than Janet could count. Much of the stadium's seating had been physically ripped out to accommodate more tents and sleeping areas. All these people, who are they, Tyrese? You're about to find out. He moved ahead and motioned for one of the refugees to come forward. It was a woman, probably in her 30s or 40s, though Janet could hardly tell ages these days. Wasteland living added years to even the youngest survivor. What struck Janet as odd was the clothing the refugee was wearing. Pristine jeans, unscuffed boots, and a clean shirt with no holes. The realization of who these people were was starting to hit her. Carolyn, this is Janet Trishella. She leads the people trying to re-establish New Purgatory. Carolyn shook her head. Tyrese, I told you. You need to face facts, Carolyn. Tyrese cut her off. Your people are running out of supplies. If you don't integrate, you're going to fall apart. Janet put it all together. You lead the refugees from the towers. Not just the big one, but all of Morrison's old holdings. Just the ones that survived. When your Crusaders brought down the tower, the rioters thought they would do the same with us. We fled here. Without protection from the Marines, we'd lost a lot of people and most of our food and medical supplies. We're dying in here, Carolyn explained. Janet felt disgusted that she had been lured here. These people lived in luxury compared to hers, and they were still complaining. She turned towards Tyrese. Are you one of them? Janet asked. No, but I've done what I can to help them. They're still people that need help. That's what the Crusaders set out to do. A philosophy you must still believe. Janet wanted to unsling her rifle and fire on all of them. And then she remembered what Alex had told her about the Crusaders. They were over. The psychopathy Morrison had created with his rule was destroyed, and so was the group that ended him. Gratuitous violence was no longer a tool Janet could rely on with the many diamond refugees that surrounded her. Otherwise, she was no better than New Purgatory's last despot. And when she stopped to look around, she saw that it wasn't just adults. There were children, those that had been born into a life of luxury and knew no other way. They were in for rough lessons, just like she had when her father had passed, but it would make them stronger. There will be adjustments your people will have to get used to, Janet started. You will have to share your space, and I can't guarantee that the old refugees will like you or even accept you, but I can guarantee your safety. Carolyn looked over at Tyrese. Her sneer had changed to an eyebrow-raised surprise. Janet could see hope burning behind her eyes, a fire that might have been extinguished the moment Morrison's Marines abandoned civilians for the outskirts of New Purgatory. It was a new chance for them to build, the right way. Get your doors open, and I'll have my troops come in and take stock. List your concerns and needs to them, and we'll see what supplies and mechanics we can divert. As Janet went to turn away, Carolyn extended a hand. Thank you. You could have. Janet started walking away. I never said I had to like you either. She made way for the tunnel, never sparing a glance back. When Janet got outside, she reached into her flight jacket for another cigarette, but found nothing. She realized she had smoked her last one down in the tunnel. It's gonna be a minute before I find another pack. Fuck. She went towards one of the welders and held up 2 fingers. The man reached into his asbestos suit and passed her one. The welder held up his torch, and Janet brought the smoke to the open flame, even though she could feel the skin on her face heating up. She didn't care. It was a chilly morning. She found Tyrese sitting on what was left of the garden stairs. I'm glad I was right, he started. It wasn't about power. You care about people. Janet flicked the ash of her cigarette towards the gaping hole left by her sapper's explosives. They didn't kill my friends or start our war. They don't deserve execution. Or starvation. Janet sat down beside the man and took a long drag off her smoke, holding it in for a few moments before exhaling a long plume. I'm guessing you have other questions? Tyrese asked as he lit up his own cigarette. Why are you so interested in us? The Crusaders are gone. Dead for the most part. If anything, we're just a memory of what people can do if they work together. The story you tell people to motivate them. That's just it. Someone must keep that memory going, or people will forget what bought them their freedom in the first place, Tyrese answered. Finding the bodies of our dead and putting them to rest helps with that. It's not as simple as that. I got lucky with Dewey Goose tags. The other 2 took a lot more searching. Well, wait, you found more? Janet asked. Yeah, they're back at my place in S4, along with some other shit I wanted to show you. Janet flicked her cig into the pit. That's where Alex got his start. Take me there. Well, shit, Janet said, looking out at the destruction that was Section 4. The older refugees told me East Harlem always looked this way, Tyrese replied. I wouldn't know. My dad never took me out before the city was shelled. Not that I'd remember it anyway. Come this way. Vale led Janet down several alleyways before stopping at one where the center had been blown open. Bricks with old dried blood littered the entrance. This had been the site of an old battle. Vale walked into the alley. He was careful not to step on the many bricks. Janet was less formal and looked for any place to get a solid footing. Here, Vale called out. Janet moved beside him and looked up at the wall. The painted writing was still fresh, if a bit dusty. The Crusaders. This was Alex's declaration of war against John Morrison. It was a calling card, like the false reports spread by Morrison's people about his group before they began their fight. Janet remembered Alex telling her how he turned the tyrant's fiction into fact, and that Elias had been the one to write it. I thought it was just a story. I should have known better than to not believe those 2, Janet said. Alexander and Elias? Vale asked. Janet turned her head towards him. Most people don't even know their names. Just what they accomplished and how they did it. Talk to the right people down here, and everyone remembers. They weren't invisible before they started that war. Yankee Stadium, stealing vehicles from Morrison soldiers, helping people flee from recruitment raids, Tyrese listed. Janet's eyes moved towards her boots. Yeah, I suppose they weren't as hidden as I'd like to think. I didn't spend much time around the refugees until I joined them. I always preferred moving on my own. Tyrese moved into the broken building, and Janet followed. The man had been untouched by the fighting. What struck Janet were the walls. Instead of the normal drab grays that covered so many buildings in the city, Tyrese's were covered in vibrant greens, reds, blues, and purples. On one wall was a mismatch of different shaped triangles on a black background. Another was of a woman reaching out and cupping the moon like she would cup water with her hands from a stream. Janet thought the mural was beautiful. It took her away from this place, if only for a moment. It was clear to her that Tyrese was not only a historian, but an artist. On one of his tables sat Brandon Duigu's 50 caliber rifle. It was propped up on its legs, butt resting on a piece of cloth instead of the concrete. The gun made Janet smile. She remembered when Brandon had let her clean it. The rifle had been covered in some of the thickest grime she had seen. It made her wonder how Duigu was ever able to pull back the slide for that initial round. Now it sat on Vale's table, covered in gray dust and ash from the toppled tower. "Never thought I'd see that fucking thing again," she said. Vale was opening a drawer and grabbed something out of it that Janet couldn't see. She was more focused on some of the symbols he had painted. The less abstract paintings focused on the same Crusader cross that resembled the etching on her dog tag. "These are also for you," Vale said, placing 2 more tags in Janet's hands. She looked down and read them. Siren. Reaper. She knew Siren was Neala's call sign, but she had died trying to rescue the old man. The second name she did not recognize until she flipped the tag over. Jack Newsom. "Shit," she said out loud. "I thought they both died in the tower." "Some friends of mine found the pile of bodies a couple miles south of the wreckage, along with those tags." "You thought they were there during your attack?" Vale asked. "It's a long story, but no. We knew they were already dead. We just figured Morrison hadn't bothered disposing of them." "What do I owe you for all this?" "Nothing. I want the chance to help rebuild. Part of that is going to be remembering history. A lot of people, refugee folk, hold the idea of the Crusaders close, but only a few of them know who they are and who they were. That history is important to me. Keeping it and teaching it might inspire the people, not just of today, but of the future we're building. We need a reminder to never follow in Morrison's path." "And if they do?" Janet asked. "I know you say the Crusaders are dead, but they're an idea. Ideas aren't killed so easily. If a tyrant like Morrison ever rises again, there'll be another group of Crusaders." That made a grin come across Janet's face. "You spent too much time romanticizing us, but I can see her point. I could use someone like you, Tyrese. I need an advisor, or at least another person who can get shit done. It sounds like you've got contacts and are good with people. I'm lacking on both of those fronts." Tyrese looked around the room. Janet wondered if he was glancing at his paintings or taking in the memories. No doubt what he was feeling right now put him in league with the Crusaders. Janet saw that he did not only want to keep history, but he also wanted to be a part of it. And this was his chance. "I accept, Miss Trishella. May I make one request?" "Name it, Vale." "A memorial where the tower came down, for all those who fell." Every time I think about New Purgatory, I can't help but grasp the dog tag dangling around my neck. Somewhere in the wreckage of what was a monument to a tyrant, 6 people are buried. 2 died before they had a chance for revenge. The last, my own best friend, was murdered away from our home by a bounty hunter. 5 lives, including my own, are all that's left of the group known as the Crusaders. We're scattered now, though one of the 5 continues the job we started months ago. New Purgatory. The only thoughts that follow that place are those of the fallen, and all the names I'll never forget. The guilt in me grows each day that I'm not back home. The scariest part is that I can't tell if I miss the people or the violent lifestyle we lived in that fleeting time together. I do know that Layla brought us to California to relax, to break away from war and fighting and death. When my tag chimes in the wind, though, I feel a responsibility to the people who gave their lives for me, for my home, and for the right to rebuild it properly. Their deaths brought an end to the Crusaders, but their sacrifice has given birth to a new idea. I've relaxed long enough in these short months since the tower fell and the people in New Purgatory could claim independence. The city has a new leader and an old friend, but she is threatened by ghosts from the past. A vengeful council of 6, the Morrison remnant, and raiders on the outskirts. The city needs the help of those who freed it. It needs an army. It needs Sentinels.